The Winnipeg Jets may not be playing until Friday, but a lot of their prospects are already into their seasons, a handful of games. Find out how some of our top young players are doing on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support, especially as we get into this season. Obviously, it's going to be a big year for the Jets, and I am fairly excited to see how Winnipeg does. Obviously, we are just a couple of games into the season, but plenty of stuff up ahead, and I'm just looking forward to another year of coverage. I think it's been, a long off season, and so I'm glad to be back chatting about the Jets. And that kind of brings us to tonight's episode, which, instead of talking specifically about the Jets, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the prospects. Some of our young players are currently in action, and obviously this is a pretty good time for many of our young kids. And I think a lot of us are starting to see some interesting changes to our prospect pool, maybe in how we rank some players, how excited we are about some of the core. And, there are a few guys who I think are starting to push more ahead in the pack and are really starting to impress, perhaps even above expectations. So we'll chat about that in just a moment. But before we go any further, did want to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, we're going to start off with one of my favorite prospects in the pool. This young man is one of the rare Asian-born players to be drafted to the NHL. It just never happens. For me personally, it's a really cool story. I think he's the first Chinese-born skater drafted, and that is, of course, Kevin He. And Kevin has been absolutely destroying the OHL with Niagara. I think a lot of us were very excited about him as a player because he has a really high work rate. He's a relentless forechecker, and he does actually score a fair few goals. But his offense has basically exploded in his first 6 games with Niagara. He has 15 points in 6 games. Look, he's an 18-year-old. This is his 3rd season in the OHL, but you're not really seeing many of our prospects who just in your first few games are just lighting it up. Some of the footage coming out of Niagara is really exciting. He's got shifty skating, and he'll just rip the puck off his stick, beat goalies cleanly. I mean, it's been a heck of a start to the season for him. I am very excited about because I think he was probably, when he was drafted, I think a little bit, I don't know if I would say disparaged slightly, but I think there were definitely folks who had some question marks about him, especially where he was taken. People thought that there might be better prospects at that same position. But in my mind, I think the Jets have kind of identified a particular type of player. And in a lot of ways, I'm actually pretty happy about them choosing to go for guys who skate well, who have a high work rate. Look, if they have some, offensive chops too, it's a really nice pairing, and I'm not mad about it at all. I think it's great, and he seems like a player who Jets fans are going to love. I think the Jets want players who play the right way and who sort of fit their vision of a complete-ish player. And so far, he has started to look a little more like his ceiling, maybe higher than perhaps expected. So very excited about Kevin, hoping his season continues and that he just completely rips the OHL apart. Braden Yager has also had a pretty solid start to his season. With the Moose Jaw Warriors, he's put up 7 points in 4 games. Yager, I think, is one of those guys who just, for whatever reason, just seems to exude maturity in his game. I thought when he came into camp that he was just very well-rounded, very impressive. And, had he been eligible to play in the pro leagues this year, I don't think he actually would have gone back to Moose Jaw. As a nearly 20-year-old, he is very close to eligibility, and I think he was actually a guy who really stood out in camp and preseason. I think he will be fighting for a roster spot next year. I thought he might be a little further off, but actually it doesn't seem that way at all. His defensive reads, his two-way play, and his consistent offensive production, where it was just, constantly trying to create chances down low, looking to create chaos in the crease, all that stuff really stood out. And I think this year for him, he's going to rip the WHL apart, and he's going to have a really strong season. So very excited for Jagr, and, thankful that out of the Rucker McGroarty chaos came a player who looks like he's going to be a real find for the Jets for the future. Jacob Julien, interesting player that I think a lot of us also were impressed by in camp. His OHL season has kind of started out slightly slower than I think he probably would have wanted. And I say this relatively speaking, 5 points in 7 games is nothing to sniff at. But I think for Julien, he's on a pretty deep London Knights team. And I think there's probably a part of his game where, I don't know how much better he can really get in junior. I think at this point, we're starting to see what he really is. And he seems like a really smart two-way player with some great defensive acumen. Kind of reminds me a little bit of like David Gustafsson in that way in his early pro days. And I think that just bodes well for him being a really interesting bottom six player who's also got soft hands. If he becomes like an Adam Lowry heir apparent, I think that is a fantastic best case kind of scenario. If he becomes anything in terms of like the play driving ability, you're just laughing to the bank. Same with Kieran Walton. Walton has actually done pretty well in his first 7 games with Sudbury, 9 points in 7 games. I think Walton, he's going to take a big offensive jump this year. I'm expecting him to be a bit of a powerhouse. And what always stood out from his footage, I mentioned this earlier, but he mentioned his inspiration is Tage Thompson. And when you see the way that he confidently carries the puck and dives between defenders, it's easy to see why. He's a huge 6'6" center who can also play as a winger, but I feel like his best game is hopefully going to be down the middle. He's just so smooth with possession, and he has really, really interesting puck handling ability, strong skating, and a nice shot. So I'm expecting a big year from him, and I think he is one of our very sleeper picks. For a 6th round pick, he might be an absolute home run. Colby Barlow, I think, is one of the few prospects where I'm a little concerned slightly. First 5 games with Oshawa, he has no points, which is not really what you want to see. Barlow, I think, for me, hasn't really taken some of the steps forward that I was expecting. I don't think he's a bad prospect in the slightest, but I think my concerns about his game perhaps translating to the NHL and his reduction in scoring last year compared to the previous year, it does make me wonder a little bit about his ceiling. I think for me, he is starting to slide further and further down in my prospect rankings. Definitely still a chance he becomes a good NHLer, but I think my ceiling for him has probably declined a bit, and he may be more of like a bottom 6 locker room type than a guy who really becomes a high-end NHLer, but absolutely not writing him off yet, and it's still early with a brand new team, so don't want to get too into it. In terms of our other prospects at the AHL level, Brad Lambert, 3 points in 2 games. Elias Salamonson, he's got 3 points in 2 games as well, and I think that's just the kind of production that you'd want to see at this point. I think your young players are starting to find their footing at the pro level. Specifically, Salamonson, I'm very interested in. He showed well in camp, and I just want to see how he continues to handle himself. Shibrikov, 4 points in 2 games. I think these guys are all going to try and fight for roster spots later this season. And, Salamonson might be further ahead than I was expecting. I told you before that I think he's going to adapt to North America very quickly, and I think we're starting to see that already. So very excited for him, and if his offensive game continues to grow, that is great news. Shibrikov, he's just great already. A natural little goal scorer, a pesky engine. Again, a guy who is very Kevin He-like. So Pretty excited about that. And Lambert, you just want to see him really take the next step. I think he looked pretty interesting in camp, but you could see where his deficiencies were in terms of keeping up with some of the NHLers. So for the Jets, it just seems like we've got a pretty bright future in store, and I am excited about it. Now, with the Jets currently as they are, I did mention in the previous episode, I've got some concerns about the 5v5 offense, and line practices today didn't appear to be suggesting any changes. I want to chat about that in just a little bit. But before we go any further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It is just 6 games into the season, and we already see an interesting stratification of teams. I've had trouble determining who I really feel is like a top-end team, but I'll tell you this. I think, teams like Detroit, Baltimore, and a few others are like the real deal. The Vikings have a great defense, and there's some really interesting middle-of-the-pack squads that could start to get some separation over the next few weeks. And, of course, the trades today of Amari Cooper and Devontae Adams may also shift the rankings for some of the New York-based teams. But maybe you're watching these teams and you're starting to get a hunch in the middle of the game about one of them perhaps being a Super Bowl champion. Well, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets so you'll always stay in the know about the latest NFL developments and action. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet at FanDuel.com. That's all at FanDuel.com. Get started today. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about, obviously we started off with the prospects, but we're now moving to the Jets who are playing on Friday. Lord knows why the NHL decided a week off would make sense for Winnipeg. I don't understand the NHL scheduling this year. There's just been like some weird breaks for teams, and for some reason the Jets are one of those squads. So we're not off. We're off until in Friday, and when we're taking on the San Jose Sharks. Then, of course, Sunday is the big game that I think everyone's kind of circled on the calendar for being Brian Little's not number retirement, but like his Jets retirement game. And then, of course, Rucker McGroarty's likely return to the Jets if, in fact, he plays in that game. But for me, I have some concerns about the early offensive production from the team. And practice today did not show any changes in the lines, which for me, I do worry a little bit what sort of evidence Scott Arniel needs to see before he starts to make adjustments. And look, again, I'm trying to kind of keep in mind that it is 3 games into the season, but, I would feel differently if we didn't have a fairly large sample size from a very similar lineup last year. But the Jets are essentially running back what they had in the previous season, and so we sort of know what stuff to kind of expect this year. And, it's not like Arniel didn't, come from a brand new environment. He's a complete outsider. He was on the coaching staff last year. So, his lack of changes in some ways makes me think that we're not really seeing a lot from him that's perhaps different from the bonus era. Like I said, I think there are some changes. I think, the time on ice deployments are definitely notable, and the special teams are worlds better than they were last year. But that cannot carry you all the way to a big playoff run. If your 5v5 offense, which right now is currently ranked towards the bottom third of the league, I think the Jets are somewhere in maybe 25th or 26th in expected goals for per game, which is not great. The Jets kind of have to sort that out. I know that it's still early, but the stuff that I'm concerned about with the top line, with the Perfetti Ehlers pairing not really working, that stuff just doesn't really seem to be going away. And sure, the shot metrics actually don't look that bad for some of these lines, but when it comes to the danger of the chances they're creating, that's where I think Winnipeg has really struggled. They're not getting to the middle of the ice. They're struggling to create the most dangerous opportunities. And you're looking at who it's coming against, and you're like, really? Are we really struggling against Chicago, the Minnesota Wild on the second half of a back-to-back, especially missing their best center? We didn't even see Joel Eriksson X. So for me, it does kind of call into question, how much evidence the Jets coaching staff is waiting for before they start to make some adjustments. And I'm not sitting here trying to like poo-poo the team or anything. And again, I think the coaching staff is probably more cognizant of all of this than I might be giving them credit for right now. But I do worry that it's going to continue for a while and that they're not going to make the changes that might help them spark the 5v5 offense. I think relying on CSV as your top line just so far doesn't really seem to be paying off quite as much as you'd hope. When they have the main advantage, it's a different story. Those guys together, when they have space and time and an extra skater, just completely rip apart opponents. But when it comes to even strength play, which is predominantly what you're going to be playing at, those shifts really aren't being won by this team. So I'm concerned about that. I feel like that's a problem stemming from last year. I guess the one positive is that the top line isn't getting killed. They've really just been pretty fine so far. But I think for Winnipeg, what I've continued to stress is that pretty fine for your top line probably isn't good enough. Those are some of your top scorers. And if they're not really finding the score sheet at even strength, you do worry that it's going to be a problem going forward. I know that they're going to score goals at some point, but I just sort of wonder how offensively productive they're actually going to be this season unless Arniel thinks to make a change. So some concern there. On defense, the Jets' defense has actually been pretty good. I really don't have any complaints. Winnipeg really hasn't had too many issues. I'm not even really pointing out Neil Pionk these days. So if the blue line is functional like this for the remainder of the year and the Jets maintain this really good defensive structure, which I think they rank somewhere, again, in like the top 5 or top 10 of teams in terms of expected goals against. I mean, this team could be a defensive juggernaut like they were in the first half of last season, which is great. I think that works really well for this team. It's going to give Hellebuck some support, especially if the Jets offense is struggling to score. But like I said, defense doesn't always win championships, not in this league. You still got to score goals and create them. And so that kind of remains my overarching concern. With the blue line playing well, we did get some news that Logan Stanley might be nearing a return. He was skating in practice in a non-contact jersey. Apparently, Arniel joked about him perhaps participating in some drills he wasn't supposed to. Good to see Stanley getting healthy. Obviously, I think I would have preferred him as our 7th D, but, every team seemingly has a player like Stanley in some capacity. So, again, I've kind of had to recalibrate my expectations for the Jets over the years. And, if he plays games, it's whatever, right? The only thing I sort of wonder is, if he starts to improve alongside Miller, could he become a guy who's actually a little more offensively potent? I think Stanley always shows flashes of that, and it's a shame that part of his game wasn't emphasized, because when he skates with possession, there are times where he's really dynamic as an attacking-minded defender. I think the idea of him being this big shutdown guy who's really physical has never really been his game. For one thing, he doesn't really have the physical game that you might expect. He's not super strong on the puck. He does throw his weight around sometimes, but it doesn't always seem to dissuade puck carriers from kind of doing what they do. So I think the main thing for him is just figuring out a way to make his big frame and his relatively stronger skating an asset for him, which seems to be a thing when he's, inside the offensive zone. I think there's really some dynamism to his game that I just wish the coaching staff would sort of tease out more. If you were to make him a more attacking-minded guy with a big booming shot and actually help him make better shot selection choices, I think you've got an interesting player there. But, at this point in his career, you kind of, what you see with Logan Stanley is basically what you get. And so I think, his developmental ceiling's probably a little capped. And, at this point, once Heinola comes back, Heinola, I think, should be the guy on that third pairing. But, with Fleury having played reasonably well enough in this first few games, I honestly don't know if Stanley's going to jump in immediately, but they may try to get him some games to get his skating legs back. But I think Fleury has actually done enough and done well enough to not really merit being pulled out. So it'll be interesting to see how Arniel handles this. Fleury was supposed to be a minor league player for the time being, but with injuries already being a bit taxing on the third pairing, he was obviously called into action very quickly. And I wonder if he passes through waivers this time around. So something to kind of keep in mind and consider. I thought Salamonson was going to be the guy that they might turn to for the first few games, especially if Stanley wasn't going to be out for quite as long as Heinola is. But it seems like, Fleury has done pretty well in lieu of all of that. I just wonder, once they waive him, will he actually make it through to the Moose? Having both Coghlan and Fleury in your system is actually just really nice because, at least in some capacity, they seem like they can play some NHL games. They can fill in for spot duty. And I actually think Coghlan is a guy who could become your Miller replacement at some point. I was very impressed with him in camp. I thought that he actually might have deserved a roster spot had there been some space on the right side. He looked really good, and I think he's going to be a player that's maybe a little bit of a secret weapon in Winnipeg's toolkit, especially if we start getting closer to the playoffs and the Jets can start adding some roster spots. So overall, I think, the Jets are okay so far, but I think my bigger concern is, who's going to start scoring goals at even strength soon? That's where you need to make the most hay, and you can't rely on the Lowry and Kupari lines to carry you forever. They've done fabulously so far, but I think you can kind of see that the scoring potential of this team right now, as is, it's a little bit capped. So it's time to just sort of raise that floor and get this team going again. It is still early in the season. There is plenty of time to experiment and make changes, and that's probably why I'm really pushing for them to think about it now before it gets too deep and Winnipeg becomes kind of too set in its ways. So some interesting food for thought there. Curious to know your thoughts about the Jets offense. Have you liked what you've seen? Are you a little bit concerned? Drop your comments and thoughts below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Obviously, the Jets may not be in action, but plenty of other teams out there are. And we've seen some very interesting score lines from some teams that I think were supposed to be a little bit better than they've started out. Obviously, it is just a couple of early games for a lot of teams, but we kind of take what we're given, and I think some of the stuff that we're seeing from teams like Nashville may be a little bit surprising. They have not quite had the start that I think Preds fans were hoping for. So we'll chat about some of those early score lines in just a little bit. But before we go any further, did want to shout out our friends at Hims. Guys, sometimes intimate moments happen spontaneously, and you want to be ready for anything. Your sex life is important, but your schedule is pretty busy. You don't have time to go to a doctor's office to get treated for ED. Well, guess what? Through Hims, you can get a personalized ED treatment without stepping foot outside your door. Hims is changing men's healthcare by providing you with access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. They provide access to a range of doctor-trusted ED treatments like chewable hard mints and Viagra and Cialis, plus generics that are up to 95% cheaper. All you have to do is answer a series of questions on their site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment option. If prescribed, your medication ships directly to you in discreet packaging for free. You don't need insurance, and one low price covers everything from treatments to ongoing care. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/lockedon. That's HIMS.com/lockedon for your personalized ED treatment options. hims.com/lockedon. The products mentioned are chewable compounded products which are not approved by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for details and important safety information. Subscription required. Price varies based on product and subscription plan. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting a little bit about some early score lines from around the league. Obviously, we've only been through the first couple of games for the season. Some teams have only played like one or two games because the NHL schedulers apparently were on a mad one with some of the game spacing and some of the scheduling for these teams. Just look at us. We've had 3 games and then we're off for a week already. So a little frustrating as a Jets fan, but interesting for the Central Division tonight because we have quite a few Central Division teams. And I think for the Jets, this is going to be a tough division. I think the top of the division is maybe going to be weaker than it's been in past years, but the middle of the pack is going to be very congested. And that's where I think Winnipeg probably wants to separate itself as much as humanly possible. So looking around, we've got our first couple of games. Tampa Bay beat Vancouver 4-1 earlier. I think the Canucks this year may take a slight step back. I think they're still going to be a very good team and probably one of the best teams in the Pacific, but it does seem like defensively things have been a little loose. And without Demko and net, the goaltending has kind of come down to Lenkin and company, and I think that's probably a little bit disconcerting for them. Their backups are solid, but Demko is the guy, and with him having to potentially change how he actually plays, especially in light of his pretty serious injuries that are apparently very unique, that is not the most comforting news if you're a Canucks fan. But we'll see what he's like once he returns. When he can be on form, he can be a phenomenal goalie, and maybe an adjusted, safer playing sort of goalie is going to be to Vancouver's benefit. You have the Washington Caps knocking off the Vegas Golden Knights 4-2, bit of a repeat from their Stanley Cup matchup several years ago. Caps welcome back Jakob Rauner recently, and he scored on his first action in this game, so congrats to him. Always nice to see the Knights lose. I think Vegas is still a very strong team and certainly one of the best in the West, but I think over the years their star power has declined a little bit, especially as guys like Stone have sort of aged out. So hopefully that makes them less of a threat going forward. Carolina beat New Jersey 4-2. I think we're starting to see some early big teams in the Metro Division make their case for why they're going to be playoff favorites here over the next few months. And Carolina and New Jersey are both, in their own rights, very good teams. So that should be a bit of a dogfight heading all the way to the playoffs. Florida beat Columbus. What was sort of sweet about this game was that, before anything even happened, they ran out the first 13 seconds of the game, and they left the left wing spot in Columbus empty, which, man, that got to me. That was tough to see. And sometimes it's hard to even, imagine not having Gaudreau there, but seeing it on the ice for 13 seconds, that was tough, man. Really wonderful moment. Very glad the Panthers agreed to it. And, the tribute to Johnny was beautiful. Now we start to move a little bit into some of the Central Division games. Minnesota took on St. Louis and won 4-1. The Wild, I feel like, are one of those teams that's just going to hang around this year. Kind of like St. Louis, they're going to be annoying all the way to the playoff run. I don't know if either of these squads is going to be great, and I don't know that either of them is a lock for the postseason. I kind of feel like the Wild will make it, but St. Louis is going to be more of a fringier team. So very interesting. I think both teams irritate me for very different reasons, but they just continue to hang on and somehow cause us grief. Now, the scoreline that I think is really going to stand out, Seattle versus Nashville, 7-3 in favor of Seattle. Nashville not getting the goaltending and the goal scoring that they're probably hoping for. They're definitely not going to keep shooting like 3% for the rest of the season, but yeah, probably not a comfortable feeling that, the brand new team that just brought in, Brady Shea, Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault is kind of getting its butt whooped in the first couple of games. So, like anything, it's just a few games into the season, but probably not how Barry Trotz envisioned the start of his year. Dallas beat San Jose 3-2 in a shootout. I guess beating the Sharks isn't for everyone. I don't know. Makes me a little nervous about Friday's game, so let's keep an eye on that one. And finally, Calgary beat Chicago 3-1. The Flames have actually won a fair few number of games to start the season, certainly more than I think anyone was expecting from them. They actually lead the Pacific Division, and get this, they are the only undefeated team in the division. So congrats to Calgary on a big start to the season. Should be a very interesting year for them as a team that is still rebuilding and has a long way to go. But curious to know which of these opponents and teams have really stood out to you. Who are you impressed by? Who are you kind of like, wow, they really should be doing better? Drop your thoughts or comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with even more Jets coverage, so don't go anywhere. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.